Hello, and welcome. I am Exit Light, and this is my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about a strange disappearance and reappearance that has a very, very odd twist, and possibly a connection to UFOs or the Lake Michigan Triangle. We got a lot to go on. So, before we get started, if you would please give this video a thumbs up, I would greatly appreciate it. It really helps my channel to be seen. And if you are not subscribed, please consider doing so. That also helps my channel. And if you click that bell, you'll be notified when my content goes live. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Stephen Kubaki was a 23-year-old student at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, which is a private Christian university near the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, when he went missing on February 20th, 1978, while he was on a solo cross-country skiing trip near the town of Saugatuck. The day after his trip, snowmobilers in Saugatuck spotted cross-country skis abandoned, along with a backpack, and they contacted the authorities to report a missing person. They quickly found the contents of the pack belonged to Steve, and a search and rescue mission was immediately started. Unfortunately, the only clue was a 200-yard trail of footprints in the snow leading past the edge of the lake, which ended abruptly, leading investigators to conclude that Steve had fallen through the ice to his death either by drowning or hypothermia. The area close to Lake Michigan was somewhere that Steve had visited many, many times before. Then suddenly, 15 months later, Steve reappeared in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is 720 miles due east of where he was last seen, and he had no memory of what had happened to him since the day at Lake Michigan. Was Steve a victim of the Lake Michigan Triangle? The site of many disappearances of planes and boats and people over the years? Before we get into that, let's get into some of Steve's background. Steve grew up in South Deerfield, Massachusetts, in a lower middle-class family, where his father worked in a tire factory and his mother was a secretary at the University of Massachusetts. He graduated from Deerfield Academy in 1972. Steve was due to graduate that spring from Hope College. Bob Neymar, a 1978 Hope graduate who didn't know Kubaki personally but had heard about him after he had disappeared, said that from everything he heard, Steve was described as brilliant. He was a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons and also described as a little more free-spirited than the average student at the conservative school, which is why he lived off campus. Steve was also an enthusiastic lover of the outdoors. He enjoyed hiking, and he had climbed mountains while he studied in Europe. On Saturday, May 5th, 1979, 15 months after he had gone missing, Steve reappeared standing in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 700 plus miles east from Lake Michigan. Steve had no memory of the year and a quarter he had been missing, and he said he didn't immediately realize how much time had passed until he bought a newspaper and he saw the date. He found a way to get to an aunt's house in Great Barrington, which is about 20 miles from Pittsfield, and then he was reunited with his family in South Deerfield. At the time, Steve told reporters that he had found himself with $40 in cash, new glasses, new shoes, and a t-shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin that he didn't remember running. He said none of this stuff belonged to him. He also had a backpack filled with maps and hitchhiking signs, including from San Francisco, Sacramento, Reno, Utah, and Chicago. In one of the interviews he was giving after he had mysteriously popped back up, he's reported as saying, "I feel like I've done a lot of running." He had his memory right up until his disappearance. Everything was clear. And it remained intact. He said the last thing he remembered was feeling cold and scared. He believed his memory loss was caused by exhaustion and exposure and said he would see a medical doctor for a physical, but he refused to see a psychiatrist. Steve explained that by saying that he had been in good mental health when he set off for a skiing trip. His father was going to sign over his house. He had 3 courses at school, and they were all going well. He had just left a romance in Germany. He said there was no problem with girls, and he had a job already lined up with the Holland Sentinel newspaper. He was fine. He certainly wasn't of the frame of mind to harm himself. The detectives who had investigated Steve's disappearance had never been convinced that Steve had gone under the ice because they had failed to find a body in 15 months. They even sent his dental records to Chicago to see if Steve might be among the serial killer John Wayne Gacy's unidentified victims. So, could he have blacked out and got amnesia by falling on something, a rock, ice? Or could he be a victim of the Lake Michigan Triangle? Let's talk about the Lake Michigan Triangle for a moment, shall we? The triangle has been the site of many unexplained air disasters and shipwrecks over the years. There have been many possible explanations for these strange events put forward, including UFOs, strange weather events, even time portals. On June 23, 1950, Northwest Airlines Flight 2501 was flying from New York City to Seattle with 58 people on board. Over Lake Michigan, Captain Robert Lind radioed in a request. He asked for permission to descend to 2,500 feet because he was in a severe electrical storm with high winds. But permission was denied, and then the radar went dark, and there was no further communication from Lind. The aircraft then failed to arrive at its final destination in Seattle, and Flight 2501 had officially vanished. A search of Lake Michigan for the wreckage was immediately started. They found no airplane. However, human remains did begin to wash up on the shore of the lake in the days following. This was despite a yearly search funded by the thriller author Clive Cussler and undertaken by the Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates. There were reports of strange, unexplained bright lights over the lake on that same night that Flight 2501 disappeared. Then, in the summer of 2007, the board responsible for the Grand Traverse Bay Underwater Preserve was conducting a sonar survey and taking an inventory of each shipwreck located within its boundaries. This group was comprised of concerned divers who organized and sought to preserve wrecks for future generations since they were already so well preserved. The team conducting the survey were volunteer members of the Nautical Archaeological Society. There was sonar imager Brian Abbott and maritime archaeologist Dr. Mark W. Hawley. In May of 2007, while moving from one wreck to another, they accidentally came across an arrangement of stones in Grand Traverse Bay. It was out of place, and at the time of its discovery, there were no similar features discovered anywhere else in the lake. So the Grand Traverse Bay stones became a site, and it is a long line of stones a mile across, arranged from southwest to the northeast in about 40 feet of water. Each stone in the arrangement ranges from the size of a basketball to that of a small car. They stand out as an arrangement of stones on an otherwise featureless sandy bottom. There are at least 2 circles within the arrangement. The petroglyph boulder is roughly egg-shaped and is 5 feet across by 3 feet high in height, and despite popular belief, it is not located in the center of the arrangement, but in fact, just outside of it. After reviewing the photos that were taken of the stone arrangement, Dr. Hawley had spotted that a particular stone had what appeared to him to be a petroglyph, of a prehistoric mammoth or mastodon. No one associated with that project had prior experience in a site quite like this or with prehistoric rock art before, so afterward they conducted another dive to verify the find and the images that they had taken. With this petroglyph, they became convinced that this was in fact a cultural site of significant age, considering that the mammoth petroglyph, as woolly mammoths and mastodons had gone extinct in the Midwestern United States about 11,000 years prior. Once the prehistoric nature of the stones was verified, Dr. Hawley reached out to the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa tribes of Native Americans about the site. After presenting the site to the tribal council, they decided that they wished to keep the site confidential and, out of respect for their ancestors and to preserve it from any destruction, they didn't want any mapping done. This is why the location of the find has remained unpublished to this day. The site has subsequently been called the Lake Michigan Stonehenge, and some have theorized that these stones exert some sort of force which has caused the strange weather effects and disappearances in the area. Also, the plane crashes and the sunken ships. But since the site of the stones has not been the subject of a detailed archaeological study, little evidence for this theory exists. Is it possible that Steve was abducted by aliens? Steve's case is cited by many UFO and alien abduction theorists as a classic case where someone is snatched and then reappears sometime later, not knowing where they've been or what has happened to them after their quote-unquote experimentation. Steve went on to further his education and become a professor and a psychologist. And in recent years, Steve practiced in Seattle as a psychologist, providing psychotherapy and consulting services since 1993 for adults, adolescents, children, couples, and family. He provides treatment for such conditions as PTSD, trauma, bereavement, relationship issues, depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, borderline disorders, ADHD, bipolar, conductive disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and Asperger's. And it's ironic that he had refused to have any kind of psychological exam after he disappeared. Steve co-wrote a book in 2017 with Brian Blackmore, and it is called The Meta-Mathematical Foundations of Existence. The book is described as, in the mathematical foundations of existence, the authors prove that existence is infinite in its universes and realities. Everything imaginable and unimaginable is possible. For many years, Steve has refused to speak about his disappearance with the media. He's ignored repeated requests for interviews by journalists. His parents, who reportedly spent thousands of dollars on a private investigator after he went missing, refused to believe that their son had died, and they have since passed away. But in 1979, Steve told reporters that he was going to try and retrace his steps to piece together where he had been and what had happened. However, it is unknown whether he actually ever undertook that journey. Thank you for coming to my channel. Please go ahead and leave a comment below. Do you have any ideas, any thoughts? Do you know any stories? Have you experienced anything in the Michigan Triangle? All right. Good night.